Chapter 19, the Vietnam War. First, we'll start off by looking at a few of the basics, just some generalizations of the war. Really was the longest in U.S. history. Our total involvement lasted from about 1959 to 1975, although major troop involvement was from 1965 to 1973. It cost the U.S. $200 billion, and about 58,000 Americans were killed during the course of the war. Our learning objectives for the first section of the chapter is to explain the reasons why the United States became involved in Vietnam. You also should be able to trace the escalation of U.S. involvement in Vietnam and compare and contrast the war strategies employed by North Vietnam and the United States. So just looking at a few of the vital details on Vietnam. Vietnam is rich in many natural resources. It was first conquered by China. France came in the 1500s for spices, and Vietnam had a long tradition of resisting imperialism. And Vietnam, along with neighboring Cambodia and Laos, which you can see here is Laos right next door, and Cambodia down here, those three nations combined together to make up what became known as French Indochina. During the period of new imperialism, France conquered that whole area. And here we have some photos. These are actually some of my father's photos from when he fought in Vietnam. So, give you an idea of what the countryside looked like. A little hard to see, but there's actually a little hut right back in here along this tree line. Okay, now we move into looking at Vietnam during World War II. Vietnam had been conquered by Japan during World War II, and of course France was preoccupied in Europe. During the course of World War II, the Germans overran France, so Japan, looking to expand their empire, moved into Indochina. And in fact, many of the Vietnamese starved to death as the Japanese confiscated the rice and then sold it. The U.S. assisted Vietnam in fighting against the Japanese. We worked very closely with Ho Chi Minh, who was really the leader of the resistance movement. We actually spent time training them, fighting alongside them, sometimes against the Japanese. And Vietnam became independent very briefly at the end of World War II. And here we have Ho Chi Minh. He brought independence to Vietnam, was once an ally to the United States, and he preferred communism to capitalism. Now, most people recognize him as predominantly a Vietnamese nationalist first, communist second, but nonetheless, the fact that he was communist did become an issue as we moved into the Cold War years. And his followers were called the Viet Minh. And here we actually have a copy of a telegram sent by Ho Chi Minh to President Truman. In the letter, he asks for Truman's assistance in resisting the French recolonization of Indochina. And so, looking at Truman's response, Vietnam's first independence was not recognized by the United States. President Truman was concerned about the growth of communism, and so the U.S. backed the French return in 1946. Okay, now looking at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. It was fought in the spring of 1954. 50,000 Vietnamese surround 13,000 French. The U.S. refuses to get involved, although we were financing most of the war by that point in time, but we would not escalate the involvement. And as a result, the French surrender. After the French surrender, Vietnam was divided by a political agreement into North and South at the 17th parallel. The communists feared U.S. involvement, and this compromise of dividing the country was reached, with, like I mentioned, with the 17th parallel being the dividing line, North and South. Ho Chi Minh led the communist North, while Ngo Dinh Diem led the anti-communist South. Governing the United States' actions in Vietnam was the domino theory. So this became our U.S. policy in Southeast Asia, and we believed in supporting countries that were resisting communism because when one country falls, others will follow. We kind of believe that if Vietnam fell to communism, that it may be Cambodia, maybe Laos next, then maybe Thailand, then Burma, and then it may just continue to spread around the globe. And who knows at what point we might be able to stop it. So we believed we had to draw a line there and keep South Vietnam from falling. Now, looking at South Vietnam under Ngo Dinh Diem, so Diem was the South Vietnamese leader. He had been educated in the West, and he governed from 1954 until 1963. And he was viewed as a corrupt dictator. Now, oftentimes during the course of the Cold War, the United States supported repressive regimes as long as they were favorable to the West, and that was the case here. He was anti-communist, so therefore he was our ally, but at the same time, he was known as being a very brutal dictator. And that ends up becoming a major liability for the United States. So here's a look at the American dilemma. Diem was an unpopular leader. Elections would result in a communist victory. So, normally the United States is in favor of elections because we believe in democracy. But yet we knew if we had a free election there, that would bring Ho Chi Minh into power. And the Vietnam domino would fall. So JFK sent in 1,500 advisors. Their main role was to spend time with ARVN, which was the Army of South Vietnam, and train them and give them strategic advice, but they really weren't supposed to be engaging in combat themselves. And here's a look at a Buddhist monk setting himself on fire in protest of Diem's government. Diem was an ardent nationalist, or an ardent Roman Catholic, I should say, a very devout Roman Catholic. And the predominant religion in South Vietnam was Buddhism. And this Buddhist majority felt like they were being oppressed by the policies of Diem. Vietnam, as one of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Maxwell Taylor, said 8,000 men were needed to resist a communist takeover now. He said China might enter the war and feared that Vietnam would become another Korea. Military increases from 1,500 to 16,000 Americans. Then we have the death of two leaders, starting with the overthrow of Diem. He's overthrown and murdered in Saigon on November 1st, 1963, as part of a coup d'etat that had been carried out largely by members of the South Vietnamese military with the approval of President Kennedy, although Kennedy did not intend for them to go ahead and kill Diem, but he did approve initially of toppling him from power because Diem had become such a liability because of him being so unpopular in the South. Then, just about 3 weeks later to the day, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963. And now we'll have a look at LBJ and Vietnam. Johnson took over the presidency after JFK's death, and he increased American involvement in Vietnam, and mostly because he wanted to save South Vietnam. He, of course, knew what happened in terms of China falling to the communists in 1949, and so, Truman kind of took a political hit for that, and he didn't want to be known as the person who lost Vietnam. And then we had the Maddox incident, and the ship pictured here in the upper right, the USS Maddox, was fired on off the Gulf of Tonkin, which is, or in the Gulf of Tonkin, right off the coast of North Vietnam. Here you can see the basic route that the ship was taking right along the coast. Many people believe that the ship deliberately kind of taunted the North Vietnamese to provoke an attack, but at the time that was seen as an act of war. So the Maddox was an American destroyer fired on by the North Vietnamese. A communist PT boat is destroyed. Johnson orders a strike on North Vietnam naval bases in response. And Johnson's popularity increases in response to this bombing. And this also leads to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, where Congress said, in effect, take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. They consider this in many ways to be a blank check. Congress did not actually give a declaration of war, but they pretty much gave Johnson very broad and vague powers, which enabled him to escalate the war. So, the Viet Cong continue to invade the South. Now, the Viet Cong were a combination, really, of a guerrilla fighting force made up of some North Vietnamese and some South Vietnamese peasants. The Viet Cong were primarily farmers by day and warriors by night. Many of them began to also, invade the South from the north, coming in along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was a network of trails and supply routes leading from North Vietnam to South Vietnam. The Ho Chi Minh Trail also passed through parts of Cambodia and Laos as well. And as I mentioned, they employed guerrilla warfare or hit-and-run, hide-and-seek type tactics. So they would, for example, launch an attack and then retreat back into the jungle, and oftentimes they hid in underground tunnels. Our response, Operation Rolling Thunder, which this was a sustained 8-week bombing campaign, bombing North Vietnam, particularly the capital Hanoi and Trail. One of our goals, particularly on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, was to stop the supply and troop movements, and it did inspire the communists to keep fighting on. This photo here, it was taken at the Castle Air Museum in Atwater, California, what used to be Castle Air Force Base. And this was one of the planes used in Operation Rolling Thunder. You can kind of get an idea of the massive scale of the bomber here. If you look down at the bottom, this is my son, who I think he was about 3 at the time, but you can see he was about 3 feet tall, and so just completely dwarfed by the plane. Okay, and here we'll look at the escalation of U.S. forces. So here we are, January 1965, 20,000 soldiers serving. Now look at what happens just throughout the year 1965. By the end of 1965, we have 200,000, so we've increased our numbers tenfold. Then by January of 1968, we hit the maximum troop involvement of 540,000. Okay, now as we move into the next section, looking at our learning objectives. So by the end of this section, you should be able to explain the impact of guerrilla warfare. Related question or related item: describe the tactics used by the Viet Cong. Explain the impact of the Tet Offensive on the home front, and then describe the effect of the protest on the war effort. So we'll start by looking at the Viet Cong battle tactics. As I mentioned, that they were a combination of sometimes North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese. Well, they disguised themselves as locals, so they blended right in with the local population, became virtually indistinguishable from other civilians in the South. They didn't face Americans on the battlefield, and they tended to retreat into tunnels. They had 125 miles of tunnels in 1965. And they also tended to use landmines and booby traps. One of the booby traps or types of booby traps they typically used were called punji sticks. And you can see both of these pictures here depict punji sticks. So this picture over here on the left, you've got a soldier walking kind of right in between two rows of punji sticks. And then over here on the right, these punji sticks, my father took this picture, but actually you have a fence made of these punji sticks. Okay, and these are some of my father's photos from Vietnam, and here you can see the massive damage caused to some of these vehicles by landmines. So my father worked in a shop where they repaired the construction vehicles. So, like I said, they saw several of these. He knew several people who lost their lives and lost limbs as a result of landmines. Of course, it wasn't just, the landmines weren't planted in places where they're just run over by vehicles. Also, sometimes people stepped on them as well, and could thus also have very catastrophic effect as well. And these are just some more of my father's pictures. Once again, you can see another vehicle damaged heavily by a landmine. There's a tank. That was my father out on the base. There he was with his machine gun. And there he is standing next to a Huey helicopter. And then this is just kind of a great poster. It says, "This vacation, or your next vacation, visit beautiful Vietnam." And of course you see the soldiers down here below. So a little irony there. Okay, and this brings us to the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley, which was the first major engagement between the U.S. and the North Vietnamese. Oftentimes in Vietnam we were fighting against the Viet Cong, but here this was a direct major conflict against the NVA, or North Vietnamese Army. This was also the largest and last major land battle of the war, and the Ia Drang Valley was known as, or called, the Valley of Death. And this whole thing took place at a place called Landing Zone X-Ray, which is the base of the Chupong Mountains. And all in all, we had about 450 soldiers there. But they were largely outnumbered by the Vietnamese. In the end, 247 Americans are killed, and about 1,500 North Vietnamese were killed. This was Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, who led the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley. And a quote from him, "I will leave no man behind, dead or alive. We will all come home together." Tunnel rats. These were small American soldiers that crawled into the tunnels to fight the Viet Cong. And oftentimes these tunnels were booby-trapped, but they played a valuable role in the war effort. And here's a look at one of the ARVN soldiers preparing to bury his infant son who had been slain by the Viet Cong. And speaking of the Viet Cong, here we've got a look at a couple of the Viet Cong prisoners. Then we hit a major turning point in the war in January of 1968 with the Tet Offensive. Tet was the Vietnamese New Year, and what took place, this was an attack, a coordinated attack by the NVA and the Viet Cong, launched during the Vietnamese New Year. Leading up to the Vietnamese New Year, it had been kind of traditional to have a ceasefire, and also we were quite used to seeing large numbers come into the major cities of South Vietnam to celebrate the New Year. So when the VC started coming in, they didn't attract a lot of attention because they had already, and we knew they blended in with the local population, and it was not unusual to have large numbers come to the cities anyway. All in all, 100 South Vietnamese cities and towns were attacked during the Tet Offensive, and it took the Americans 3 months to get the upper hand. And here's a look at the attacks of the Tet Offensive. So everywhere you see one of these red flashes, these are all spots that were attacked during Tet. One of the major battles of the Tet Offensive was the Battle of Hue, which is the old ancient imperial city in Vietnam. So this was a major battle in the Tet Offensive. 142 Marines and 384 South Vietnamese were killed over 24 days. So a little over 500 lost their lives there. And that was, on our side, but when you look at the casualties on the other side were even greater. North Vietnamese losses were 8,000. And here's a quote from Marine Private John Moore during the Tet Offensive. "I dove over a wall after crossing the street a couple of times. Cement chips and branches flew everywhere. It was so bad we couldn't even pop up and fire." And here we have a look at Khe Sanh. Khe Sanh, pictured right down here, a major combat base that we wanted to protect, surrounded by mountains. This was one of the areas we had a difficult time defending during the Tet Offensive as well. And here's some more photos from the Tet Offensive. And these are ARVN soldiers here, the South Vietnamese Army. Some more destruction from Tet. And this was actually, here's a photo. There was also a video caught of this, of a suspected Viet Cong prisoner being executed at point-blank range. And once again, some more damage. I believe that was from Hue. And now looking at the home front. Americans were divided over the war, so some were very supportive, some even wanted to escalate the war even further, and yet others were completely opposed to the war and felt like we needed to get out. So those that supported the cause were known as Hawks, and those that were opposed were known as Doves. The Tet Offensive divided the nation even more. After Tet, many people began to question why we were over there. Contributing to that Walter Cronkite, a well-known, well-respected TV anchor, traveled to Vietnam during Tet, and in his report, he stated something to the effect that it appears now more certain than ever that something to the effect that we're fighting a war we can't win. After that, public confidence in us winning the war faded. So even though the Tet Offensive went down as a victory militarily, in terms of the public perception, it hurt us tremendously. And looking at the strategies of North Vietnam and the strategies of the Americans were completely different. In past wars, we usually had some kind of strategy to conquer territory. There were no territorial goals here, so instead they used body counts to measure success. And in that regard, we were successful. We killed many more of them than they killed of us. But the North Vietnamese strategy had planned for that. And I can't remember if it was either Ho Chi Minh or General Giap. But one of those two had made the statement that they would kill a few of ours, we would kill many of theirs, but we would tire first. And that was their philosophy, their strategy and approach to the war. And in that regard, they were right, and their strategy paid off. As Americans became more divided over the war, we began to lose the will to keep fighting. And continuing our look at the home front, we also had the first draft since the Korean War. Some protesters burned their draft cards, as you can see here. 50,000 protesters marched on the Pentagon, and 70,000 potential draftees fled to Canada and other countries to avoid the draft, which is a crime, but they did that rather than to be drafted. And so the controversy over the war continues as we head into the 1968 presidential election. Lyndon Johnson does not seek re-election, largely because he was facing criticism from within his own party and even being challenged from within his own party for the nomination. His own vice president, Hubert Humphrey, was questioning his policies. Bobby Kennedy was entering the race, and then on the other side, so here we have, as I mentioned, Vice President Humphrey opposes Johnson's wartime policies. Candidate Nixon, the Republican nominee, says that he will end the war. So on March 31st, 1968, that was when Johnson dropped the bombshell, saying, I shall not seek another term as your president. And now looking at General Westmoreland, who, by the way, actually to back up here, this is Westmoreland, we can see down here, meeting with LBJ. And so he really led our forces over there early on in the war, and he exaggerated the death and casualty figures to garner support for the war. Life magazine kind of portrayed a different picture of him, and at this point in time, more hawks were becoming doves. We ended up with 1,000 soldiers that were dying monthly in the Vietnam conflict. And looking at the year 1968, on top of everything that we've seen so far with the Tet Offensive starting in January, 1968 was a very tumultuous year. Other major events: Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April, and then Bobby Kennedy was assassinated in June. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated just after winning the California primary. And then major riots broke out between the police and protesters at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Continue our look at the 1968 election. Nixon runs against Humphrey and George Wallace. His campaign slogan was "Peace with Honor." And also at this point in time, 18-year-olds could fight. In other words, you could be drafted at 18, but you couldn't vote. Now, fortunately, largely in response to that, that has been changed. They've lowered the voting age. It was 21. And here we have a photo from Bobby Kennedy's campaign as he was passing through Modesto. And this was taken just days before he was assassinated after winning the California primary. And here we have actress Jane Fonda. She's also the daughter of another very famous actor of the past called Henry Fonda. But she created a lot of controversy when she visited North Vietnam, met with American POWs, and pictured here, she's actually pictured with some of the North Vietnamese, and they've kind of hard to see in that photo, but there's also some of the stuff there, some of the weapons used to shoot down American pilots. Many people considered her to be a traitor. Another incident from 1968 was the My Lai massacre, and this took place on March 16th, 1968, although news of it didn't break immediately. It was some months later that we initially found out about it. The massacre was led by Lieutenant Calley. 350 innocent Vietnamese women, children, and elderly were killed, and the war really had reached its lowest point. And of course, this also added to the conflict over the war, as once again now people saw American soldiers simply mowing down as innocent South Vietnamese who they were supposed to be there to ultimately to support. Vietnam Moratorium Day. This took place on October 15th, 1969. 1 million Americans protest the war. This was the single largest demonstration in U.S. history, and college campuses at the time were divided. Then, looking at Kent State University, demonstrations took place there in 1970. The Ohio National Guard was called in, and through the chaos, 4 students were killed and 10 were wounded as the Guard opened fire on the protesters. Nixon calls the demonstrators bums. Okay, so now looking at the next section. Here, by the end of this section, you should be able to trace the ending of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. You should be able to explain the effects of the U.S. withdrawal and list the cost of the war to the United States. So, the war ends. Okay, Nixon turns over the war to the South Vietnamese. His policy is called Vietnamization. Henry Kissinger negotiates for the United States. The POWs are released in 1973. And we finally withdraw all of our forces in 73. After we withdraw our forces, North Vietnam continues to attack South Vietnam, and South Vietnam collapses. The Americans leave, and the Communists keep advancing on the South. President Ford wants to intervene, but Congress refuses. And Saigon, the capital, falls. The picture you see here in the background here. Find my mouse. Here we go. The helicopter here. This is on top of the U.S. Embassy as they're evacuating people. Mostly they were evacuating mostly American officials and some other selected South Vietnamese, but other people were pushing their way through the gates of the embassy Once on the grounds, they were evacuated as well. Now looking at the end. Once again, as I mentioned, this was the longest war in U.S. history. A total price tag of $200 billion. Military hardware left behind. 3.5 times more bombs were dropped than in World War II. 3 million people killed and over 1 million wounded. 30 years later, the trade embargo is lifted in 1994, and President Clinton visits Vietnam in the year 2000. And evidence of the U.S. presence is everywhere. Reasons why the U.S. got out: guerrilla warfare, tunnels and booby traps, and then the morale at home. Looking at Vietnam today, they've now had more than 30 years as one nation. They are united under communism, although they seem to be moving more towards a free market type economy. They're showing signs of progress. Looking at Ho Chi Minh's legacy, Ho died in 1969 while the war was still underway. He is considered to be the George Washington of Vietnam, really their first leader. People visit his body daily in Hanoi. Looking at Vietnam today, they have most favored nation trading status with the United States, and they have full diplomatic relations with the United States. Our Vietnam veterans, 87% of Americans hold great esteem for the Vietnam veterans, and the Vietnam vets have the lowest unemployment rates of all vets. And most Vietnam vets have adjusted well to civilian life, although initially upon returning, unlike many past generations where they had received a hero's welcome, many of them unfortunately did not receive that. There were no parades. Some of them were even spat on and labeled baby killers, mostly with reference to the My Lai massacre, which of course isn't fair. Most of them weren't. Most of our men returning had nothing to do with the My Lai massacre, but nonetheless, they still face that treatment. Now, looking at Vietnam in the movies, many famous, well-respected films have covered Vietnam. They're often critical of government and war in general, and most of these are not exactly school appropriate. Now looking at Vietnam veterans in government, there are 13 veterans in the U.S. House of Representatives, 5 in the Senate, or at least there have been. Senators John Kerry and John McCain, both were war heroes, and both of them ran for the presidency. Kerry was the Democratic nominee in 2004, running against George W. Bush, and John McCain ran against Barack Obama in 2008. And here we have the Vietnam War Memorial, which is the most visited site in the District of Columbia. There are 58,000 names on the wall, and a tribute to those who served and died. PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, once was called shell shock and post-Vietnam syndrome. This was a new term and diagnosis in the 1980s, largely in response to the Vietnam War. And it is characterized by severe psychological and emotional war-related trauma. 72,000 Vietnam vets are being compensated for it. Agent Orange. This was developed in the 1940s. It's an herbicide that controls plant growth. 6 million gallons were dumped on Vietnam between 1963 and 1966 with the major goal of killing off the foliage that would provide hiding places for the VC. The chemical was shipped in 55-gallon drums that were orange striped. Vets exposed to it have more health problems. Lawsuits total 180 million since the 1980s, and it has also been linked to severe birth defects. Now, looking at the lasting legacy of the war, we have many new ways to look at war. In general, people are much more critical of government and critical of war in general, but yet we still have continued to have involvement with smaller countries. And now there's also a lot more focus on veterans issues.